Hello, comic creators. Welcome to the first Comic Connection podcast recording for 2023. So happy New Year to everybody. Happy New Year, Andy. How you doing?
I'm all right. Happy New Year, Gamal. Happy New Year, dear listeners.
Fantastic. We actually have quite a bit of news and ideas to dissect in our podcast, because we'll just jump right into it. The first story is actually coming to us from the New York Times, and it's related to Steamboat Willie, which is the original version of the Disney character Mickey Mouse, and how that character is shortly going to enter into the public domain. And in our Discord server, we actually had quite a bit of discussion about what this means, not specifically for Mickey Mouse, but what it means for public domain and what it means to actually make comics with public domain characters. Now, Andy, you actually had a very insightful analysis on this in the Discord. So why don't you share that with the people? And if I have anything extra to add, I will. If not, I will.
Right. I'll begin by qualifying this with, I am not an attorney, therefore I'm not giving legal advice, but Gamal is attorney, so if he stays silent, he is endorsing what I am saying as an attorney.
Almost, yes. Go ahead.
Okay. So I have looked into this, having been an editor and a publisher and whatnot. I've looked into public domain a number of different times and from a number of different angles. And basically what I have come down on figuring out is it is a risk versus reward analysis that ultimately you're going to come down to making a decision on based on your comfort level with the risk versus the potential reward. But the two major factors that I see are, first, clearly understanding what it is that is in public domain. And we'll use Mickey Mouse as an example. So Steamboat Willie comes into the public domain. It is not the same thing as saying free reign on Mickey Mouse, right? What that means is the version and the story from Steamboat Willie, the short, in which I believe it's been a while since I've seen, but I think Mickey pretty much only whistles in it. And he's got a particular uniform and a particular animation style. That version of Mickey Mouse and that story is entering the public domain. So that does not mean that you can do a story with Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. That is not in public domain, and you will almost definitely get sued and lose. So understanding exactly how that works, like what you can and can't use, is really, really important. And this obviously pertains to the really popular stuff that has continued to be new material. It continues to be produced year after year after year. So things like Dracula and Frankenstein, they have all these different iterations. They're not all in the public domain. In the case of Dracula, Bram Stoker's novel is in the public domain. So you could theoretically use stuff from the novel with less risk. But the other factor is also just doing the research to find out what people are getting sued over. Is it like the example I gave is that my understanding is that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's estate is fairly litigious. And with Sherlock Holmes, at least some of his stories are in the public domain. They tend to go after anybody using Sherlock Holmes, even if the use of Sherlock Holmes is based on public domain material. And the analysis there is, do I want to deal with, pay for, whatever, getting sued potentially to use this character? Other estates are not as litigious, so they seem a little bit less risky. And it's not that they'll necessarily win the case, but they're probably assuming you don't want to fight it and are just going to settle out of court and give them some money. It's probably what they're looking for. So again, risk versus reward analysis. Do I love this public domain thing? Am I sure I understand what's in public domain? Do I think I can make money off of it? And then am I likely to get sued or raked over the coals? I guess there is sort of that public component if you're seen as like mining or being disrespectful to the source material. That can get you into sort of more, social public arena trouble with potential fans. But that's another factor. Those are sort of the two, maybe three things I'd really be looking at before I went out with my Steam Willie comic.
Well, have you ever actually considered going to law school? Because the analysis you gave was fairly fairly complete, and you didn't have to spend like $250,000 to say that. So
I have considered going to law school, and then I found out exactly what you just said, and then I reconsidered it after not having that money to spend.
Oh, well, very good. I mean, the only thing that I would add to what it is that you said is two things. One is people need to really understand the difference between a copyright and a trademark. The copyright in the story, Steamboat Willie, actually includes the characters, the narrative, and the elements that actually went into the story. But a trademark is something, a word, a image, a sound, a slogan that people use to sell things. And though trademarks do not go into the public domain unless whoever had the trademark let the trademark lapse. So the idea that, and this is something that was coming up a few months ago when we were talking about Superman and Batman and things like that. There are, in the same way you talked about versions of Steamboat Willie going into the public domain, there will be versions of Superman and Batman and other characters going into the public domain, but that does not mean that you're going to have free reign to use those names because those trademarks are still valid. So there is a scenario where the first episode or the first issue of Batman, that story is in the public domain, but Batman, the name, Batman, the Bruce Wayne, all of those trademarked names are not in the public domain. So you may not be able to use it even if theoretically that character is in the public domain. So because there's such a tangled web when it comes to comics and copyrights versus trademark and public domain, my usual advice to clients is don't bother. You are much better off creating a character of your own based on these archetypes than trying to tap into a pre-existing audience to sell more copies because you think, a public domain character already has, a fan base that you could tap into. That fan base is usually not going to be worth the time, effort, risk, reward of actually dealing with all that stuff. So you might as well just make a character of your own, and then you don't have to worry about it. It can be based on Sherlock Holmes or Superman or Batman or whoever. But if it's not that character, you don't have to worry about it. So moving on, the next story is actually about, it comes from us from Publishers Weekly, and it's about how companies like Marvel use their characters to actually, from a marketing standpoint, tap into various different demographics at various different interests using the same group of characters. The example that's being used in the article is Black Panther. And the way that Marvel has actually positioned Black Panther is, of course, they have the comics, they have the graphic novel, they have the movie, but they also have, for children, they have kids' books focusing on characters like Shuri. For other demographics, they have cookbooks, or they have art books, or they have their Masterworks collection that does historical comics. They have technical books that actually have schematics and blueprints and all these other things, none of which are, in a strict standpoint, comics, but all of them create a brand new revenue stream for IP that taps into groups that otherwise, may not read comics. And I think what comic creators can actually learn from this is if you own the IP, you can potentially do anything you want with it for any different demographic, psychographic group that you want, as long as A, you own the IP, and B, you can figure out what it is that's going to appeal to that group and then give that group what you want based on your IP. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I have thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts, actually, because I've worked in sort of the IP department at different places. I'm just trying to make sure I'm not running afoul of any NDAs.
Okay. Take your time.
But yes, I mean, I guess one of the ways that I've always thought for larger companies that you would use licensed materials is really just to keep adding value and recognition and expansion of fan bases of your fans, right? Like just you're, and one of the reasons why I think it's such a great deal for the IP holder is that you're essentially getting paid to have other people market your characters and your stuff. Like that's it seems like a no-brainer in terms of a business model to me. I have found though that in different aspects of consulting gigs that it is remarkably difficult to get larger companies that aren't necessarily like in the IP business or aren't strongly in the IP business to understand the real value and power of that. But you know, there are IPs out there that were created as one thing but became popular as the licensed thing. And that's really where the value of that IP came from, even though whoever created that license thing, like let's say it was a toy and the comic became popular, right? Micronauts is a good example. Like Micronauts became a really popular comic, but the toys in the United States didn't really take off.
Exactly.
But Micronauts, the IP, retains the bulk of that value more than the original publisher.
Oh, absolutely. I think the biggest example that I always look at is Peanuts and Snoopy. I mean, the original comic strip has a certain amount of value as a comic, but the fact that they, for like 20 years, licensed Snoopy to MetLife Insurance Company for hundreds of millions of dollars, that's where the value of Snoopy is. The value of Peanuts is in, you know, when CBS, you know, created those cartoons back in, I don't know, the Roman era, and now they show them every year for Christmas. That's where the value of Snoopy is. It's not necessarily in the comic strip, it's in all the other things. So I think if you're building IP, you want to make sure that you actually hold on to as many of the rights that you can and get paid for letting those rights go, because you don't know where the actual value of your IP is. It may be in the comic, it may be in the toys, it may be in something else. So if you just give that away like blindly, and that's what I see a lot of people do in the creator-owned stuff, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, you're actually giving away, usually for no compensation, the bulk of the value of the intellectual property you created. So I would caution, if you're not getting paid for something, then do not give it away. That's just a basic rule of thumb that I have. The next story is actually the inverse of the kind of grand use of IP, and it comes to us from Forbes, where it talks about the amount of self-published books that are actually produced in a year and sold in a year is actually quite high. It's 300 million books are actually sold from self-published authors or publishers in any given year. But the fact of the matter is that the average book only sells about 250 copies. Now, if you look at that from a comic book perspective, 250 copies is probably not going to cover the production cost of the book that you made. So which means your book is running at a loss if you only sell 250 copies. And the key, according to the article, and I think I agree with what the article is saying, if you do not have a specific marketing plan and you do not, that you put in place before the book comes out, you're running the risk of having a book, and regardless of the quality of the book will not sell because you don't have a group of people to sell it to. So we talk about this a lot in the live chats and in the Q&A sessions, that marketing has to be one of the most important development pieces of your comic outside of the production, because otherwise you can have a good comic and have a good system and then not sell any comics.
Yeah, there are those comics or any creative endeavor that you do just because you believe that it's worth doing, right? Or you are driven to do, right? That if it winds up having a great marketing plan, that's great, but even if it didn't, and even if it didn't sell, you were going to do it anyway, and you're comfortable with that, right?
Mm.
And then there are those things where you're like, that is a great idea. Let's develop that because I know I can sell the heck out of it,
Mhm.
right? And then you go to the creative side and be like, well, if I'm going to spend my time doing this, I might as well make it really good,
Mhm.
right? What I see a lot of, especially through Comics Connection and through Comics Experience courses, are a lot of people that don't kind of understand the difference and don't, and because they really are passionate about a thing, they feel like therefore it is marketable and it will find its audience magically, and
Mhm.
that not impossible, but is fairly rare that it does happen that way. And so one of the things that I feel like, kind of like we were talking about before in terms of the risk versus reward analysis of it, is of course I want to be passionate, I want to believe in what I'm doing, I want to make it good, but I also want to make sure that as best I can that it is marketable, that it's something that has an audience, that there are people that want it.
Mhm.
Especially if I'm going to take the time to make a thing, or the expense to make a thing, I'd like for it to be enjoyed by as many people as possible.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so there are definitely certain types of projects that are easier to sell than others, right?
Mhm.
Or there are even publishers or creators that have built a particular audience over time. And so sometimes one project selling through Dark Horse is going to put up very different numbers than if it was sold through Dynamite, right?
Mhm.
Or, so a lot of times it's also partnering with the right partner who can help you with that marketing and help get you access to those people. But yeah, I agree with you. The earlier you can figure out, am I good creatively and am I good from a marketing standpoint? For me, I want to have both of those things,
Mhm.
both of those boxes checked off.
Absolutely. I mean, what a lot of things that we talk about in when we're having the live discussions that we have every week is there is a market because the world is broken up into so many niche markets now. There is a market potentially for every story, I believe. The question is not, is there a market? The question is, can you find that group of people, connect with that group of people, and get them excited about your project? Because we have
And is it
fewer.
big?
You're right. Exactly. Can you actually leverage enough of them to make the project worthwhile? Because we have fewer and fewer mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream hits nowadays. So you have to actually figure out exactly who it is that's going to read this book and how you could actually connect with those people before the book comes out so that when the book comes out, you already have a ready audience. It's one of the things that I think comic publishers don't really spend a lot of time on at this point because, and this is a segue into the next story, they're looking to actually make their money in other ways. There was a story that came out just today. It's actually a prediction kind of opinion story that came for us from ICV2, and it's talking about trends in the comic book industry for 2023. And one of the trends that Rob mentions, Rob Salkowitz, is that the fallout from things like the Aftershock bankruptcy and heavy metal falling behind on their payments and other companies kind of being in the same boat is going to continue because economic pressures from outside of comics are coming in to influence the comic book industry because so many publishers were counting on making money from what I continually refer to as the maybe movie model. They were not actually thinking about, well, we're going to make money on comics. So the idea that now you have interest rate hikes and, companies pulling back on making certain types of films, investors pulling back on the money that they're putting into certain types of companies. If the publisher is going to, if the model is we're going to make comics so that we can make movies, that's not necessarily going to be a winning recipe in 2023. I have been saying this for, I don't know, 2, 3 years that the model of making comics to make movies is like a backwards model. And it seems like a lot of this is actually coming to fruition now. We will see if companies like Aftershock and all these others who position themselves that way, like AWA and companies like that, how are they going to ride this out? And if you're a creator trying to make a deal with one of these companies, what are you going to do to actually like weather this storm?
I have so many thoughts.
Well,
So many thoughts. So first of all, I agree with you about the maybe movie market. I think my favorite case of that was Radical Comics, who I give them a lot of credit for realizing like they didn't even have to make the comic. But the movie Oblivion is based on a comic that they never made. I really like that movie. I like that movie a lot. But my point being, even they were like, I think they just got to a point where they're like, well, we don't even need to make the comic. We just got the people involved to do the development work. Why should we spend all the money to make the comic that's probably not going to earn that money back on a movie that still was going to have to go through several rounds of greenlighting to actually get made? And that's the rare case where one actually got made. But I like that one because Radical was just like, no, like we're not even going to pretend that we're actually interested in making comics. Everybody else pretends to some degree that they're interested in making comics. They have people on staff that love comics. So there's a lot of, I think, genuine love of comics in those companies. But yes, as a business model, it seems a little weird. Like, I don't know, the whole idea of like, I want to be a basketball player. So I'm going to get really good at hockey. And then hopefully somebody in the hockey arena could be like, I'll bet he'd be really good at shooting hoops. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you want to go make a movie, write a screenplay. Like, you know, like it's, and they're different skill sets. It's weird. Which is not to say that a good comic can't come from a movie idea or whatever, but I think it's just, the whole thing is weird. And then the idea being we're going to go get a bunch of investor money, and these investors are going to be like, hey, we're going to make movies off of these things. And you wind up in, Cycle of Doom.
Cycle of Doom. We should probably trademark that.
Yeah.
I don't know what trademarking it for.
EX's next comic, Cycle of Doom. But and this is the thing that I was explaining on the boards about the companies. I think the companies that go out and they drum up a decent chunk of investor money, I think often they really don't realize what that's going to do to their company, but it changes the focus of the company.
Yes.
Right. You can go out with all these great ideas. We're going to create these new things. It's going to be awesome. And we do love comics. I really do love comics that start in on this. And then they take that investor money, and all of a sudden these investors are going, what are you going to do with my money? How are you going to spend my money? And they want to direct enough, and they want to see an ROI. And this is one of the things that Rob talks about in his article is with the interest rates going up, all of a sudden investors are going to want to see a return on their investment a lot quicker because interest rates are going up and they need to make more money quicker. They've been more patient when the interest rates are lower. I thought that was a really great insight from Rob. But now you've got these investors that are going to want to pull their money out. And so you're like, well, hold up. And then you go and you hire a bunch of really expensive people and you go, look at what we're doing with this money. Look at who we've hired. Look at this super cool art that we paid far too much for, all this stuff. And meanwhile, the things you went and got the investor money for to be able to do, you can't do because you just spent most of that money on showing the investors that you're doing cool things. Not that this is a Venn diagram of two completely separate circles. There's overlap, of course, but you wind up in this cycle going, now I have to show people all this cool stuff I'm doing so I can raise more money so that I can get back to the thing I wanted to do originally, but now I have to show them all this new cool stuff. And you wind up in this cycle where your company winds up going further and further into debt. And then eventually you go out for another fundraise and people go, yeah, this stuff is really cool, but you guys are carrying a lot of debt. I'm not sure I want to invest in that. And that's when the house of cards falls.
Exactly.
And creators don't get paid. Vendors don't get paid. Investors probably don't get paid. And everybody gets hosed on them.
Yes, and there is no movie at
Right?
the end of it.
And there's no movie. Or there is eventually a movie, but nobody involved in it makes any money because those rights got liquidated
Mhm, mhm.
with a right out from under everything. Um,
Exactly.
yeah. Whereas there are other companies that don't set up that way, that set up more grassroots related, and they grow much slower, much more slowly, but they earn an audience bit by bit instead of sort of buying into one. That's usually only interested in the one project that you hired the creator that they love for.
Mhm.
It's really hard to translate that into loyalty to the company or really loving what the company does when it's project by project. Whereas a more grassroots level thing, like you do what you do and you build an audience over time, you get them involved in your crowdfunding, you get them involved in your sales at the store, you get involved in your variant cover program because it speaks uniquely to them or what have you, and you can build this thing organically. Again, it's gonna build much more slowly, but it'll build in a way that, if you're smart at all, it's sustainable
Right,
and it's a lot stronger.
right. And you're not going to all of a sudden file for bankruptcy.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. Which actually leads us to our final point, which is a specific related issue in the aftermath bankruptcy. And it's a story that comes to us from the Comics Journal. And by the way, all of the links, if you're watching this video, all the links is going to be in the show notes so that you can actually take a look at all of these articles. But the last article comes to us from the Comics Journal, and it talks about the disposition of the intellectual property for creator-owned comics. Now, for anyone who is not familiar with the idea, if you do a creator-owned comic with a publisher, in theory, you own a part of the IP and the publisher owns a part of the IP. And to determine who owns what part, you have to look at the contract that's set up to do the deal. Now, when a company goes bankrupt, like Aftershock, a lot of the assets of the company are used to pay off the debts that the company has. And it's unclear in a lot of cases when you're talking about creator owned deals, is that IP part of something that's going to be liquidated? And if it is, does that mean the creator who brought the deal to the company is now losing the rights to their IP because the company's you selling it off to, pay off pre-existing debt? Or can the creator like claw back their IP from the company, leaving the company with even fewer assets to pay off their debt, but the creator gets to walk away with their IP and try it again someplace else? Now, it's almost always on a case by case basis. And I do this work a lot with my legal clients. I actually have two clients this week that I'm potential clients that I'm doing consultations for because they're worried about getting their rights back for their comic. But Andy, what I wanted to ask you was, as a person who has done creator-owned work, as a person who has published creator-owned work through your own publishing company, what is it that a creator should actually look for when going into considering a deal with a particular publisher to protect themselves from this kind of issue, in your experience?
Um, it can be difficult, but what I look for are, first of all, I want to understand exactly what it is I'm signing. What are the rights I'm granting to them, and what is my participation
Mm-hmm.
in them? So, like for example, with CEX Publishing, where I'm the publisher, when we're making a deal with creators, there's an option when it comes to all those ancillary rights. They can hold on to those ancillary rights, have complete control over them, and they can go out and sign all their movie deals and licensing deals that they want on their own without having to consult with us at all. And then they get the bulk of that money because they're doing all the legwork, and we get a percentage because the theory being publishing the comic and all that is very useful and
Mm-hmm.
be published by a reputable publisher. So, but we get like a small piece of that. Or if they don't have that infrastructure, if they don't have their own agents or managers, or they don't want to be bothered with it, or they frankly don't think it's worth the time to do it, then they can do the other deal where we are going to go out, we're going to do that legwork, and that expense, that time, all that stuff is on us to do, and then we can make the deal, and they share in it. So either way, they're getting something if a deal gets made, right? They're getting, and the payout's pretty good. So so that's what I think we do. Like, I don't look, and that's one of the reasons why I feel comfortable telling people, like, we publish comics we want published. We're happy to go do that stuff. We've got the infrastructure to go out into Hollywood and do all that kind of stuff, but we want to publish your comic, and if you want to keep those rights, you can do that. So that's one of the things, is I like knowing that my publisher is actually interested in comic, right? The other thing is reversion clauses. Is making sure that you understand how or when the right to terminate. And in our contracts, there's multiple different ways that it can terminate. So those are sort of the key things. I don't know, like, I don't know if CX declared bankruptcy, which is not happening, just FYI. If that were to happen, like, I don't know how that would work, because, like, you know, I don't know. I don't intend to find out how that works, but yeah, I mean, my hope would be that we'd just be able to give the creators their rights back.
Yes, I mean, from a altruistic moral perspective, it makes sense that the publisher, in many cases, because if they know the company is going to shut down because of the bankruptcy, to just give the rights back. The problem there is the trustee, but yes, I believe it's a trustee who is actually managing the bankruptcy, wants to retain as many rights as possible because they have to have something to pay off the creditors. So you may want, as a publisher, to give people their rights back, but the person administering your bankruptcy probably doesn't, because they need something to sell. And a publishing company, by and large, the main value is the IP itself. There's not a lot of other things that the company can sell, unless you have equipment, inventory, stuff like that.
Is that going to be different for one of those companies that has all the big investors, right? Aren't the investors going to be like, we're going to freeze all the assets before you can't just give them back real quick?
Exactly.
Right. But like in my case, where I don't have investors, like, I could just do that and then just pull the company down and then figure out how to pay off any debts to vendors. But I could, in theory, if I were to shut down, but I'm not shutting down. But in theory, if I were, I could, in theory, give everybody their rights back, shut the thing down, and then figure out how to deal with whatever debt I have to any vendor.
If that is the way it's structured in the contracts, yes.
Okay.
But again, that's not legal advice, and you didn't need it anyway because you're not going bankrupt. Okay.
But is there anything else that you recommend people look for? I mean, other than understanding what it is you're getting, what you're giving up, and what you're getting for it, and how and when you get it back.
Yes. Well, you always want to actually be able to understand the rights, revenues, and responsibilities. You want to understand what it is you're giving up, as you said, what it is that you're getting, and what it is that you have to do in terms of the contract. But the other thing that I believe is very useful in terms of due diligence is actually understanding the business model and the reputation of the company that you are dealing with. The problem is, a lot of creators, because they spend months or sometimes years trying to find a publisher willing to give them a deal, they quickly want to close that deal because they don't want to have to go out and start looking for another publisher. That's the last thing they want to do.
Yeah.
Yes. So what they do is, when they bring me the contract and I say, okay, this is all the things that are wrong, they're like, yeah, it's wrong, but I don't want to have to go look for another publisher. And my position on that is, you have to, as hard as it is to find a publisher, you need to still be selective about who it is that you're working with, which means going beyond the contract, reaching out to your networks, to social media. Does this publisher do they actually release a comic? Do they actually pay their creators what they're supposed to be paid? Are they paying their vendors? Are they based on making comics, or are they based on maybe making movies? this information is gonna largely be available. Like if you keep typing in the name of this publisher and the news always pops up in like the Hollywood Reporter and Variety and about all their options and all this other stuff, but you rarely see anything about comics, that is a clue. Maybe they're not interested in making comics. Maybe like in your example, there was no comic. If you actually talk to other creators on message boards or like on our Discord, we have a channel devoted to info on publishers, info on, creators. Does anybody have any experience with like, before you sign a deal with Action Lab, you should probably ask people about Action Lab and see what people say. And if you get back weird information or you don't get back any information, that's going to color your decision on whether or not you should actually do that deal. And ultimately, if it doesn't look like a good deal, or if it looks like a weird deal, don't sign that deal. You are better off having no deal and owning your IP rights than signing a bad deal and owning nothing. Especially if,
generally speaking, if creators have had a good experience with a publisher, they will say that.
Yes.
They've had a bad experience with a publisher and would like to warn you off, but are sometimes a little cagey about saying that publicly, or someone they don't know that well or whatever. If you are met with largely silence or sort of vague, dodgy answers, that is probably indicative of, I would say that would be a very big red flag.
Yes, and the key there is it's not that people are kind of giving you silence because they want to give you silence. There's provisions in contracts, confidentiality and non-disclosure provisions in contracts that explicitly say you as a creator cannot ever tell anyone else the terms of this contract or the outcome of this deal, which means if we do the deal and I screw you, you can't tell anyone, which actually perpetuates the cycle with more creators coming in because they don't know exactly what's going wrong with this publisher. So in a lot of cases, you will get either silence or you will get, kind of, because people don't want to be in breach of contract, even if they had a bad deal. So like you said, if there was a good experience, people will just tell you because there's no downside to that. If they didn't, they may be contractually obligated to not tell you. And you need to be able to decipher that when you make a deal. And if you don't have a deal, the better option than making a bad deal is making your own comic. It's something that you can do if you can't find a publisher to work with. That's all the wisdom that we have for today. And I do believe we've actually gone over time.
We've gone way over.
Okay, well, in that case,
if you're listening to this for free, you got like double or triple your money worth this week.
Exactly. You get what you pay for. We will be back in a couple weeks to talk about more of the news and insights for the comic book industry. But until then, if you'd like to join us at Comics Connection, all those links will be in the show notes. So until next time, have fun with your comic.
Let me throw in one last shameless plug.
Okay.
Comics Experience at comicsexperience.com has their introductory comic book courses for writing, art, and coloring, all starting at the end of January. They're all open for enrollment. If you're looking to make 2023 your comics year, it's the perfect place to start. And all our teachers are working professionals, and they're awesome, and they love teaching. So there you go. Check us out.
Fantastic. And those links to all of those classes will also be in the show notes, so you can actually check them out. Join the Comics Experience Workshop classes and get more insight in creating your comics. So thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And we'll see you next time.